He doesn't even know what day it is half the time. The neurologist appointment is already scheduled. Once we have that diagnosis in writing, we file for guardianship. Power of attorney transfers automatically. And then everything, the house, the accounts, the settlement fund, all of it becomes ours to manage. He won't be able to contest a thing. That was my son's voice. I sat in my car in the parking garage of Oregon Medical Group, a small digital recorder in my hand, and listened to every single word of it. I had found the recorder by accident. My son had left it on my kitchen counter 3 weeks earlier, told me it was a spare one he wasn't using anymore, said I could dictate notes into it if I ever wanted to capture thoughts without typing. I was 67 years old, not 97. I could still type perfectly fine. But I took it anyway, because that's the kind of man I was: polite, accommodating, always making room for people who took up more space than they deserved. The recorder had a voice activation feature. My son didn't know I knew that. What I heard on it when I finally played it back one evening had nothing to do with me dictating notes. It had everything to do with my son and my daughter-in-law sitting in my living room 3 weeks ago while I was supposedly upstairs napping, discussing in very precise detail how they planned to have me declared mentally incompetent. I didn't say anything, didn't confront them, didn't call a lawyer that night, or the next morning, or even the week after. I listened to the recording 4 more times, then I made a copy. Then I began to think very carefully about what came next. My name is Walter Greer. I spent 31 years as a cardiologist at Providence Heart Institute in Portland, Oregon. I have read more EKGs than most people have read emails. I have stood in operating rooms for 12 hours at a stretch without sitting down. I have delivered news that broke people and news that saved them, and I have learned over a very long career that the most dangerous moment in any situation is the one where you react before you think. I thought for a long time. My son's name is Derek. He was 41 years old at the time this began, and he had been married to his wife, Renata, for 9 years. They lived in a house I had helped them purchase in Lake Oswego, a suburb south of Portland that real estate agents describe as aspirational and that I describe as expensive. They drove matching SUVs. They took 2 vacations a year to places that required passports. They had no children and, as far as I could tell, no savings. What they did have was debt. A considerable amount of it, as I would later discover: credit cards, a second mortgage, a personal loan Derek had taken from his business partner and never mentioned to me, an investment in a restaurant concept that had closed after 14 months. The total, when my attorney eventually compiled it, was just over $400,000. I had not known the extent of it. I had known things were not entirely stable. Derek had borrowed $40,000 from me 2 years prior, told me it was for a business expansion, paid back roughly half before the repayments quietly stopped. I hadn't pressed him. He was my son. I trusted that he was handling things. That trust turned out to be the most expensive thing I had ever given him. My late wife, Carol, had passed 4 years before all of this. We had been married 38 years. When she died, I took a year of leave from the hospital, came back slower and quieter than before, and eventually retired 18 months later than planned, simply because I didn't know what else to do with my days. The house we had shared for 26 years was paid off. My pension was comfortable, and there was the settlement, a malpractice case from a colleague whose negligence had been partly attributed to a system I had helped design, a case that had been resolved 2 years after Carol died, resulting in a fund of approximately $2.3 million held in my name, money I had always planned to leave to my children and to the hospital foundation we had supported for years. Derek knew about the settlement fund. He had always known. And in the year after Carol died, the questions had started casual at first, the kind of thing a son asks a grieving father. What are your plans for the house? Have you updated your will? Do you want us to help manage some of the accounts, just to take the burden off you? I had answered gently and changed the subject each time. The recording changed everything. The neurologist appointment my son had scheduled without telling me, using information he had apparently obtained from my primary care physician through a forged authorization, I would later confirm, was set for 11 days after I found the recording. The plan, as I understood it from listening carefully, was to bring me in under the pretext of a routine checkup my son would claim I had agreed to. The neurologist, a doctor. Holloway at a private clinic in Beaverton had apparently been briefed by Derek to assess for early-stage cognitive decline. Renata had researched guardianship filings in Multnomah County and had already drafted a preliminary petition. They were not waiting for me to get worse. They were manufacturing the paperwork for a condition I did not have. I called my attorney the following morning. His name was Raymond Chu, and I had worked with him on Carol's estate. He was 63 years old, meticulous, and completely unsentimental, exactly the qualities I needed. Raymond listened to the full recording without interrupting me once. When it was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, before we do anything else, I need you to get a neurological evaluation, independently. A full cognitive battery from a physician you select yourself, with documentation of every result. We need to establish a clinical baseline that no one can dispute." I told him I had already made the appointment. 2 days prior, at OHSU, with a neurologist I had known for 15 years. Raymond almost smiled. "Good. Now, tell me everything you know about how they're accessing your accounts." That part took longer to unravel. Over the following 3 weeks, Raymond and a forensic accountant he brought in named Patricia Weston began piecing together what Derek and Renata had actually done, not just what they were planning. The results were worse than I had expected and, in a strange way, clarifying. Derek had convinced me 14 months earlier to add him as a secondary contact on my investment accounts for emergency access purposes. I had agreed because it seemed reasonable at the time, because he was my son, and because the paperwork had been slipped into a stack of other documents I was signing during a visit when I was tired and, frankly, distracted by grief. What I had actually signed, as Patricia explained to me with her reading glasses pushed to the top of her head and a stack of papers between us, was a limited power of attorney that gave Derek the ability to make transfers of up to $25,000 per transaction without requiring my secondary authorization. He had used it 11 times in 18 months. $260,000 moved in careful, spread-out increments that had not triggered any automatic alerts. All of it had flowed into an account in Renata's name at a credit union in Vancouver, Washington, across the state line. Patricia set the document summary down on my kitchen table and looked at me. "Dr. Greer, this is financial elder abuse under Oregon statute. Criminal, not just civil." I looked at the numbers for a long time. Then I said, "How long before they notice we've been looking? A week? Maybe 10 days if we're careful? Then we have work to do." The next phase required the kind of patience that does not come naturally to most people. It came naturally to me. 31 years of medicine teaches you that rushing a process because you're uncomfortable with waiting is how patients die on tables. You prepare. You control the environment. You do not act until you are ready to act completely. I kept my routine unchanged. Had dinner with Derek and Renata on the second Sunday of the month, as I always did. Accepted their invitation to a birthday dinner for Renata at a restaurant in the Pearl District. Let Derek walk me through a financial planning overview. He had prepared a document that was, as Raymond later confirmed, designed to make me voluntarily consolidate all of my accounts into a single structure that Derek would have full administrative access to. I listened to the entire presentation with the expression of a man being mildly helpful, asked a few gentle questions about the process, and told Derek I'd think about it and get back to him. 3 days after that dinner, I transferred the settlement fund to a trust structure Raymond had established, naming a professional trustee through a fiduciary services company with whom Derek and Renata had no relationship and no legal standing. The transfer was entirely within my rights, entirely legal, and done while I was demonstrably and documentably competent. I signed the paperwork at Raymond's office, in front of 2 witnesses and a notary, with my OHSU cognitive evaluation results sitting in a folder on the conference room table. I also had 2 things installed at my house: a security system with interior and exterior cameras, and a second digital recorder in my study, activated by sound, positioned behind a row of medical textbooks I had never taken down. The guardianship petition was filed 11 days after my son's neurologist appointment, the one he had scheduled without my knowledge, the one at which I had not appeared, the one that had resulted in an administrative note that Dr. Holloway had been unable to complete an assessment due to patient non-attendance. Raymond intercepted the filing within 24 hours. The petition listed multiple grounds for alleged cognitive decline, including what Derek described as increasing forgetfulness, confusion about finances, and erratic decision-making. My OHSU evaluation, completed 3 weeks prior, showed cognitive function testing in the 91st percentile for my age group. The psychologist who administered it wrote in her notes that I was alert, oriented, verbally fluent, and demonstrated above-average executive function and memory recall. Raymond filed a response the same day. He also, at my direction, notified the Oregon Department of Justice Elder Abuse Unit. This is the part that people, when they hear it later, always find surprising. I didn't want to confront Derek privately. I didn't want to give him an opportunity to apologize his way out of what he had done, to cry and explain and promise restitution in a way that would let him walk away with a smaller consequence than he deserved. I had watched that happen in medicine. The physician who makes a serious error, expresses genuine remorse, and returns to practice because no one wanted to be the person who ended a career. Sometimes the compassionate response is also the irresponsible one. My son had stolen from me, systematically, over more than a year. While I was grieving his mother, he had filed a legal document claiming I was mentally incompetent, using falsified information and a forged medical authorization. He had planned, with his wife, to gain legal control of my finances and, by extension, my life. Compassion had nothing to do with what came next. The criminal investigation took 4 months. The DOJ Elder Abuse Unit worked with the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office and, given the involvement of the Vancouver account, with federal investigators as well. I cooperated completely, provided every document, every recording, every bank statement Patricia Weston had compiled, sat for 3 separate interviews, answered every question, and said what needed to be said without softening any of it. Derek and Renata were arrested on a Tuesday morning in March. I was not there. I had deliberately arranged to be at a cardiology conference in Seattle that day, because I did not want to be standing on my son's front lawn watching him be handcuffed, and I did not want the image of my daughter-in-law's face when the door opened to be something I carried with me for the rest of my life. Some distances are healthy. I learned that from Carol, who always said that the kindest thing you can sometimes do for yourself is refuse to watch. The charges were serious. For Derek, financial elder abuse, fraudulent misappropriation, forgery in the 2nd degree related to the medical authorization, and filing a false guardianship petition. For Renata, financial elder abuse as a co-conspirator, fraudulent receipt of stolen funds, and obstruction. Their attorney, a man named Gelder, who had handled several high-profile cases in Portland, and who carried himself like a person who had never lost, filed a motion to dismiss the guardianship-related charges on the grounds that the petition had been filed in good faith based on genuine concern for my welfare. The response from the district attorney's office was concise. The petition had relied on a medical authorization that Derek had forged. The neurologist who had been contacted had not independently assessed me. The grounds listed in the petition included specific financial behaviors, account transfers, asset restructuring that Derek described as evidence of incompetence, which were in fact moves I had made legally and deliberately to protect myself from Derek. The state's position was that the petition was not a good faith welfare concern. It was a preemptive attempt to neutralize a potential victim before he could respond. The motion was denied. I did not attend every day of the pretrial hearings. I attended the ones that mattered. The day the forensic accountant testified about the wire transfers, I sat in the 2nd row and watched a prosecutor named Andrea Voss lay out, in plain and careful language, exactly what $260,000 looks like when it moves through a family member's account in increments designed to avoid detection. She was methodical and unsparing, and every number she read aloud had come from Patricia Weston's work, which had come from my instruction to look carefully in the first place. Derek sat at the defense table and did not look at me once during that testimony. Renata looked at the table the entire time. Gelder's strategy shifted after the forensic testimony. He moved away from contesting the facts and toward mitigation. Derek's financial pressures, the weight of grief after losing his mother, the influence Renata had allegedly exerted over the decision-making. This last part was an interesting choice because Renata's attorney was simultaneously arguing that Renata had been a passive participant following her husband's lead. Andrea Voss, in her closing, addressed this directly. She stood in front of the jury and said, quietly, "The defense cannot have it both ways. Either these two people made these decisions together, in which case they bear equal responsibility, or one of them was the primary actor, in which case the other has been lying to this court about their role. What the evidence does not support is the idea that either of them is a victim of the other." The jury deliberated for 2 days. I waited at home, made coffee, read, walked along the Springwater corridor in the mornings, which I had been doing more since retiring because it was the kind of quiet that doesn't require anything from you. Raymond called me at 2:47 in the afternoon on the second day. "They're back," he said. "Can you come now?" I was in the courtroom when the verdicts were read. For Derek, guilty on all 4 counts. The foreman's voice was even, precise, not unkind, just certain. For Renata, guilty on all 3 counts. I heard Derek make a sound when the last verdict was read, not words, just a sound, low and broken, the kind a person makes when something they believed would hold finally gives way. I had not heard my son make that sound since he was a child. It did not make me feel the way I expected it might. It made me feel tired and clear in equal measure, the way you feel at the end of a very long shift. The sentencing was 3 weeks later. Gelder made his arguments. Derek's lack of prior record, the genuine financial distress, the grief that had impaired his judgment. He was measured and professional about it. I'll give him that. Andrea Voss stood and said, "Dr. Greer is 67 years old. He had just lost his wife of 38 years. He was at one of the most vulnerable points in his life. His son chose that moment to begin stealing from him. Chose that moment to falsify legal documents. Chose that moment to pursue guardianship proceedings that, if successful, would have stripped Dr. Greer of every legal right to manage his own life and resources. There is no financial pressure and no amount of grief that justifies what these 2 people did to a man who had done nothing but love them and trust them." Judge Patricia Soren looked at Derek for a long moment before she spoke. "Derek Greer, you are hereby sentenced to 16 years in the Oregon Department of Corrections." She paused. "Renata Greer, you are sentenced to 16 years in the Oregon Department of Corrections." Another pause. The equal sentencing was deliberate, and I knew it, and I felt something release in my chest when I heard it, the thing that should never have been unequal in the first place. "You are jointly liable for restitution of $312,000 to Walter Greer, representing the stolen funds and associated legal costs, to be paid from any assets not already seized. Their shared assets, the Lake Oswego house I had helped them buy, the matching SUVs, the investment portfolio Renata had maintained separately, were liquidated. The total recovered was just over $200,000. The remainder would follow them out of prison as a debt they would spend a long time paying." After the hearing ended and the courtroom began to empty, I walked toward the front, where Derek was standing with the guards before being let out. Raymond was beside me, but I had already told him I needed a moment. Derek looked at me. He was thinner than he had been at the start of all of this. His eyes were red, but not from crying, from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a story together and finally can't anymore. "I didn't think you knew," he said. "I know," I said. "That was your first mistake." He looked at the floor. "Dad, I want to tell you something," I said, "not because I expected to help you right now, but because you should hear it while you still have the capacity to think about it clearly." I waited until he looked up. "Your mother and I spent 31 years building what we had. Every dollar of it came from work, and from sacrifice, and from choosing, every single day, to put something away instead of spending it. When she died, that money was the only thing left that I could still take care of the way I had taken care of her. And you tried to take it, not because you needed it to survive, because you wanted it now instead of later. Because patience felt like deprivation to you." I let that sit for a moment. 16 years is a long time to think about the difference between wanting something and earning it. I hope you use it." He didn't say anything. The guard touched his arm and he turned and walked away. And I watched him go, and I let myself feel the full weight of it, the grief that had nothing to do with anger, the particular mourning of a parent who sees what a child has become and cannot fix it, the knowledge that love and consequences are not opposites, that sometimes the most honest thing you can do for someone is refuse to protect them from what they have chosen. Raymond drove me home. We didn't talk much. I had decisions to make about the money, the settlement fund that remained intact, the investment accounts, the house. Raymond had suggested I take some time before doing anything, and I appreciated the advice, and I mostly ignored it, because I had been thinking about this for 4 months, and I knew what I wanted to do. The house sold 6 weeks after sentencing. It had been the house Carol and I had bought when Derek was in middle school, the one with the backyard she had turned into something worth sitting in, the one I had spent 4 years rattling around in alone, maintaining as though upkeep were a form of loyalty. A couple in their 30s bought it. They had twin daughters. They stood in Carol's garden, and the wife touched the raised beds with a kind of quiet reverence that made me feel, for the first time, genuinely ready to leave. I bought a smaller house in Ashland, in southern Oregon, close to the Shakespeare Festival that Carol and I had attended every summer for 20 years. 3 bedrooms, a front porch, a short walk to Lithia Park. It cost considerably less than what I sold for, which was the point. The settlement fund I divided in 3 portions. The first $800,000 went to the Providence Hospital Foundation's Cardiac Care Access Program, which funded heart treatment for uninsured patients in the Portland metro area. I had helped design the original program in 2004 and had always meant to contribute more to it. The second portion, $700,000, went to the Oregon Elder Law Project, a nonprofit that provided free legal services to seniors navigating guardianship disputes and financial exploitation cases. Patricia Weston, the forensic accountant, served on their board. She had told me, during one of our working sessions, that they turned away 3 clients for every one they could serve due to funding constraints. The third portion I put in a trust to establish a named fellowship at OHSU's medical school, the Carol Greer Fellowship in Geriatric Medicine, for students pursuing specialization in elder care. Carol had spent the last 2 years of her career working with an adult day program in Northeast Portland. She would have found the whole story of the past year deeply upsetting, and she would have wanted something good to come out of it, and I had learned over 38 years that the best way to honor her was to know what she would have wanted and then do it. Derek would have been furious if he had known. All that money he had calculated and cataloged and planned around, the foundation of a scheme that had cost him 16 years of his life gone, redistributed into the world in ways that would outlast both of us. I found when I thought about it that I did not feel satisfied by this in a sharp or vindictive way. I felt something quieter than that, something that resembled completion. Ashland in the fall is one of those places that does not require you to work very hard to feel that life is worth living. The air carries the smell of the Siskiyou forests. The park fills with light in the late afternoon in a way that makes you slow down without deciding to. I found myself waking earlier than I had in Portland, drinking coffee on the porch before the street was fully awake, watching the light change over the hills. I had started writing, not a memoir. I had no interest in narrating my own life, as though it were meant to be instructive, but a clinical guide, practical and specific, on financial protection strategies for aging patients and their families. How to structure assets to prevent exploitation. How to recognize early warning signs of financial abuse. How to work with an attorney before a crisis rather than during one. Raymond had read the first draft and told me there was nothing like it that was written for a general audience rather than a legal one. A colleague at OHSU's Elder Care Division had offered to help me submit it to a university press. It was, I suppose, the kind of ending that makes sense only when you look backward. I had spent 31 years repairing hearts. It turned out the last useful thing I could do with what I knew was help people protect themselves from the ones who should never have been a threat to begin with. Raymond called one afternoon in early November, just to check in, the way he had taken to doing every few weeks since the sentencing. "How's Ashland?" he asked. "Quiet," I said. "Carol would have loved it." "You doing all right?" "Really?" I thought about that for a moment. The porch, the light, the manuscript open on my laptop, 312 pages of everything I wish someone had told me before any of this began. "I'm doing well," I said. "Better than I expected." "Do you regret any of it? The way you handled it?" I watched a pair of house sparrows land on the railing and then take off again, gone before I could track where they went. "No," I said. "I gave him every chance to be a different person. He made his choices. I made mine. The difference is, I'll be able to live with them." Raymond was quiet for a moment. That's probably the most honest thing a parent has ever said to me. It's the only honest thing I have left to say about it. We talked a while longer about the manuscript, about the foundation, about nothing important. After we hung up, I went back to the porch and sat with my coffee, and thought about Derek at 7 years old, the summer I taught him to fish at Crater Lake, the way he had stood at the edge of the dock with his rod, and his absolute conviction that patience was for other people, not for him. I had laughed at it then. I had spent 31 years telling patients that the heart is tougher than people think, that it can sustain enormous damage and keep working, that what breaks it is rarely one catastrophic event. It's the accumulation of small, ignored warnings, the habits that compound, the things you don't address, because addressing them is hard. I had not listened to my own counsel when it came to Derek. I had seen the warnings and chosen patience over clarity, generosity over accountability. I did not beat myself up about it. I was human, and he was my son, and love does not make us logical. But I would not make that mistake again, not with Derek, who would be 67 when he was released, older than I was now, older than I hoped the world had to be before it started being kind to him, and not with myself. I opened my laptop, went back to the chapter I had been working on, the section on how to recognize when someone close to you is beginning to treat your trust as a resource rather than a relationship. I had a lot to say about it. I typed until the sun was all the way down and the street below was quiet and the coffee had gone cold. Then I saved the document, closed the laptop, and went inside. It was enough. It was, finally, enough.